Did a scholar really find an early copy of the Ten Commandments of Moses? We know that this was given to Moses, the Ten Commandments, on Mount Sinai by the hand of God, carving 2 stone tablets. And these were to be given to the tribes of Israel. This was about 1400 BC. Now, a biblical text dismissed as a forgery in the 19th century is not only authentic, but is actually a predecessor to the book of Deuteronomy. This is what a scholar now says, but not everyone agrees with him. We have an image of these 10 Commandment stones seen here in Devon in the UK. Now, the book of Deuteronomy describes some of the events in Israel's early history and tells of several laws passed down by God, including the Ten Commandments. There were over 600 laws in Deuteronomy after that. Many scholars believe that the book of Deuteronomy was written about 2,700 years ago, and this text would date back even earlier. The claim has generated a considerable amount of attention in the media. It included a lengthy article in the New York Times, but most scholars contacted by reporters expressed doubt, saying that they think the text is, in fact, a forgery. The text was written in Paleo-Hebrew on 16 leather fragments. Kindly support my Patreon account since YouTube has again demonetized my YouTube channel. The daily posts are 5 videos daily, and they are totally different from what I have on my YouTube channel. Thank you so much for your support and that you find all my content so interesting. You'll find the Patreon account details in the description box below. In 1883, Moses Wilhelm Shapira, an antiquities dealer based in Jerusalem, brought the text to Europe and showed it to a committee of scholars in Germany, and they dismissed it as being a fake. Shapira then traveled to Britain, where he offered to sell the fragments to the British Museum for £1 million. As you can imagine at that time, this was an extraordinary amount. An expert working for the museum also dismissed it as a forgery and declined the offer. And the next year, in 1884, Shapira died by suicide in the Netherlands. After Shapira's death, his widow sold the text to a bookseller named Bernard Carriage, and its whereabouts has been lost since around the year 1900. But a number of handwritten copies of the text survive today. Now, is this text real? In a paper published in the March issue of the journal Zeitschrift für die Alttestamentliche Wissenschaft, in a recently published book, The Valediction of Moses, a proto-biblical work by Moore Siebeck, dated 2021, Aiden Dershowitz, the chair of Hebrew Bible and exegesis of the University of Potsdam, Germany, made the case for why the text is not only authentic, but it is a predecessor to the book of Deuteronomy. The text, which Dershowitz calls the Valediction of Moses, tells a story in which God commands Moses to conquer the lands of the king named Sihon. Moses and the Israelites then attack Sihon, a place called Jahaz, kill everyone, capture all the king's cities. It's a short and straightforward narrative, Dershowitz wrote in his book, and despite being shorter than the book of Deuteronomy, the text, he said, includes the Ten Commandments. Both texts also tell of the conquest of Sihon's lands, but the book of Deuteronomy includes a lengthier description of that story. Dershowitz says that this text, with its shorter narrative, was written before the book of Deuteronomy. He says, far from being derivative of Deuteronomy, this text is, in fact, Deuteronomy's ancient forebear, Dershowitz wrote in the journal. And Dershowitz makes numerous arguments to support his contention that the text is authentic. For one, he said that Shapiro's own notes show that the antiquities dealer was struggling to understand the text, and at the very least, Dershowitz said, this should prove that Shapira did not fake the document himself. The papers have a great number of question marks, marginal musings, and rejected readings. It appears to be a preliminary decipherment, and indeed Shapira was still in the process of working out the correct order of the inscribed leather fragments, Dershowitz wrote in a journal article. He said, if Shapiro was the forger, or one of the forgers of the manuscripts, why do his private papers include an not altogether successful attempt at deciphering them? It would surely be unusual for a forger to labor to understand the text that he himself had devised or inscribed. Second, Dershowitz argues that the story of how the text was discovered is remarkably similar to how the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in the 1940s. According to Shapiro's testimony, it was in the summer of 1878 that he first heard about some ancient leather manuscript fragments that had been discovered by Bedouins in a cave near the Dead Sea above Wadi al-Mujib. Dershowitz wrote, Shapiro claimed to have purchased them from the Bedouin for a modest amount. The story of the text found by Bedouin in a cave near the Dead Sea is very similar to how the Dead Sea Scrolls were found in the 1940s, Dershowitz wrote. This similarity exists despite the fact that the Dead Sea Scrolls were not found until decades after Shapiro's death. Now, Dershowitz makes many more arguments to support his conclusions. For example, Dershowitz claims that the 19th century forger likely would be unaware of some of the Paleo-Hebrew words used in the text. He also notes that the Bedouin, whom Shapiro claimed to purchase the text from, would have had little reason to create an elaborate forgery, given that they were paid only a small amount of money. But what do the biblical scholars have to say about this? There were more than half dozen scholars not affiliated with the research, and they were to give their thoughts on the claims of if this was a forgery or not. Most of them expressed skepticism and said that the text is likely a forgery. One problem the scholars noted is that the text has been lost for more than a century, making it impossible to carry out scientific tests on it. In addition, Shapiro had a track record of selling forgeries, they noted, and in 1870 Shapiro sold several inscribed objects supposedly created by the ancient Moabites that turned out to be fake. The writing on the text, the scholar said, contains a number of unusual features that suggest a 19th century forger created them, such as letters written in stanzas that an ancient writer would not normally write in. Dramatic claims require dramatic, compelling evidence, and we just don't have it with regard to Shapiro's strips. Rather, we have hypotheticals and circumstantial evidence at best, and that's just not going to make the cut, said Christopher Ralston, and he's a professor at Northwest Semitic Languages and Literatures in George Washington University, who gave a long list of reasons why the text is likely a forgery. He said, the script of the Shapiro strips is flawed, and these flaws are similar to the sorts of flaws often found in modern forgeries through the decades. Sidney White Crawford, an emeritus professor at University of Nebraska-Lincoln, who is an expert in Hebrew Bible and Hebrew language, also found Dershowitz's arguments unconvincing, saying the question of authenticity is based on the material remains, which are now missing and cannot be tested, and an analysis of the paleography, the handwriting that is, Crawford said, noting that previous paleographic studies of the text found them to contain unusual features that indicate a forgery. Studies of the text conducted in the 20th and 21st centuries relied on handwritten copies, while some of the studies done in the 19th century used the actual text. Dershowitz countered in his book an article that the paleographic error scholars have identified maybe the results of not having the actual text to study. 19th century scholars could have introduced those errors while copying the text by hand. In other words, the actual text may have looked different to the handwritten copies that survive today. Some scholars left open the possibility that the text is authentic, saying based on the few drawings that we made at the time, the fragments appeared to be poorly executed forgeries, which would not be surprising as Shapiro had already been involved in a forgery affair a few years before. This is what Michael Langlois, theology professor at University of Strasbourg, France, said. On the other hand, it is possible that the copies, not the fragments themselves, were poorly executed. Alas, we don't have the fragments themselves, hence the dilemma. So I would say that it is technically possible that the fragments were in fact genuine. This is what Langlois told Live Science. This is originally on Live Science. Please leave your comments and thank you for your support.